Is Diablo 2 Resurrected good? Frankly, I have no idea if it is or isn't, and at this point, I honestly don't care to find out. I have zero interest in playing Blizzard games or supporting them as a company, and it'll take more than just a decent remaster to bring me back. Which is honestly fine, because it's incredibly easy to avoid their games at this point. Sure, once upon a time, Blizzard games were the absolute pinnacle of gaming and synonymous with quality, but nowadays they're few, far between, and Warcraft 3 Reforged. Luckily, there are tons of games that were made in their absence, some by ex-Blizzard devs that wanted to forge their own path, some by avid fans of the series that truly knew what made Diablo great, and others by clever hobbyists hoping to put their own spin on the genre. Not to mention a handful of old-school alternatives from way back in the day. Not every attempt has been great, but a tremendous number of them have been absolutely incredible in their own way. As such, I'd like to sit down for a bit and talk about 15 incredible alternatives to Diablo 2 Resurrected. I should make a quick note that this isn't the full list. There are many other games in the genre that I won't be including in this video. These are just the ones that I think exemplify it, and that I've personally been able to get running on my PC. Let's start off with easy mode. These are some of the absolute best alternatives on the market that generally look like and play similarly to Diablo. So if you're not looking to step too far out of your comfort zone, then look no further. Specifically, let's start with the no-brainer so people don't get antsy. Path of Exile is quite possibly the pinnacle of the genre, and it has an absolute motherload of content available after years and years of support from grinding gear games. It can be a bit daunting to dive into Path of Exile, but it's well worth it once you get hooked. Unlike Diablo, class progression in Path of Exile is a little bit more freeform, with a giant sphere grid-esque upgrade tree, with a ridiculous amount of nodes in it for you to fine-tune your build to perfection. It's absolutely perfect for min-maxers and people looking for a different experience with every single playthrough. But like I said earlier, it can be a bit much for new players. I've bounced off of the game constantly and countless times, but every single time I get just that a little bit further and a little bit deeper. Bonus, they also regularly release leagues, much like how modern games as a service games release seasons. Each league adds a few new mechanics, story bits, equipment, and more. So if you're looking for an ARPG that never stops giving, Path of Exile is probably your best bet. It's also completely free. The cosmetics can be a bit pricey, but they're totally optional. Next up are Titan Quest and Grim Dawn, paired together because they're both made largely by the same people, have nearly identical class progression systems, and except for the setting, they offer very similar experiences. Ultimately, if you like one, you will like the other. These are my absolute favorite Diablo alternatives on this list, with tons of replayability, really cool interplay with the gear that you wear and the abilities you use, and a unique dual-class system with a decent amount of complexity. They've also perfectly captured the ambiance of grim isolation that Diablo 2 had, which most others on this list only come close to achieving. Titan Quest and Grim Dawn also both subvert the very common dreary medieval wasteland feel that most hack-and-slash action RPGs tend to default to. They're both still dreary and very apocalyptic, but one set in a fantastical ancient Greece and the other is set in a grungy post-apocalyptic future. Of the games I'm covering in this video, Last Epoch is probably the most faithful to the core formula that made Diablo 2 so great, and it does so incredibly well. Frankly, if I was transported back to May 15th, 2012 and was handed Last Epoch instead of Diablo 3, I would have lauded it as a truly satisfying sequel to Diablo 2. Sure, many other games on this list would also fit that bill, but many of them deviate just a bit too much here and there to truly match up. That isn't to say that any of them are any worse off for it, it's just that Last Epoch feels the closest to how I imagine Diablo 3 should have been back then. And it does so without ever feeling like it borrows too much, and manages to have its own identity, regardless of its status as a successor. I should mention that Last Epoch is also still in early access, with single player only at the moment, no multiplayer, so while my opinions could change by 1.0, it's highly unlikely that they will. Depends on the launch though. The story of Torchlight is interesting and best left for another video. That said, while I'm lumping them together in this video, I should heavily emphasize that they're each wildly different games, all based on the same core formula. Torchlight 1 is a cartoony version of Diablo 1, with an analog for Tristram, the same three classes, and a single dungeon that players are tasked with delving deeper and deeper into while trying to prevent a great evil from escaping. It's also a lot deeper, however, with better itemization, class skill trees, mod support, and the inclusion of a pet who can fight, carry loot, and even run errands in town in your stead. It's really solid and worth a try if you haven't played it already, though I should mention that it's strictly single player, which might be a detractor for some people. Torchlight 2 is a proper successor to Torchlight 1, and is also a pretty overt analog to Diablo 2, with a similar initial premise, a world-traveling adventure with multiple acts, and the inclusion of multiplayer. It hasn't necessarily aged as well as I hoped it would, but the core gameplay still holds up incredibly well, especially with the inclusion of a very robust mod support, with tons of user-generated content to pick from. Of the entire list, this is the one that I would recommend most people start with if they want an experience similar to Diablo 2, or for anyone looking to try a hack-and-slash action RPG for the first time. Torchlight 3 is not as good as it could have been. They originally intended on having it as a games-as-a-service MMO light, but scrapped the idea midway through development, and that decision definitely held the game back in more than a few places. It's not that it's bad, far from it in its current form, it's actually quite fun. It's just that it more so lacks some of the soul from the first two Torchlight games. Though I should say that it probably has the most refined combat system of the three. Sadly, because of its original origins as a MMO, they also nixed mod support, which really could have helped this game shine even after its 1.0 launch. Honestly, I thought the incredible adventures of Van Helsing Jr. would be a wash, and it took approximately 30 seconds to capture my heart. I mean, one of the classes is straight up just wearing power armor and specializes into mortar strikes, and another has an army of robots to fight for them. Even beyond that, Van Helsing Jr. is incredibly tongue-in-cheek, with really solid banter between a far more detailed main character than I expected and his ghostly companion, tossing verbal jabs back and forth right from the start and continuing throughout the game. The writing can feel a bit amateurish at times, but if anything that actually helped, as I was still paying attention and even chuckling at some of the lines in Van Helsing Jr., whereas most other games on this video that I talk about, I tended to just zone out the moment anyone started talking. And no, it's not actually called Van Helsing Jr., it's Van Helsing's son, and I have to rib it for that. Shadow's Awakening caught me by surprise, in a very good way. It plays fairly similarly to the other games in the genre, but mixes things up by giving players the ability to switch between 4 different characters at any time during gameplay. Admittedly, I only ever got to use the initial 2, but it's still a breath of fresh air to be able to hot swap between playstyles on the fly, either to defeat foes, solve environmental puzzles, or bypass obstructions. Beyond the mechanics, Shadows also leverages its protagonists far more than any other hack-and-slash RPG, having them talk to each other, discuss certain plot points, make quips, and speak directly to NPCs. It's a lot more immersive, and while it might not be great for replayability, I was far more engaged with the plot than I normally am in these games. Oh yeah, and you play as a soul-devouring demon, which is pretty metal. Victor Vran is interesting, as it plays fairly differently from the rest, with WASD movement, jumping, dodge rolling, platforming, hand-designed levels with meaningful secrets, map challenges, and more. It's a hard left turn from the usual formula for hack-and-slash action RPGs, and frankly, I actually wish more games from the genre followed its example. Additionally, Victor Vran is a semi-fleshed-out protagonist with his own dialogue, motivations, and interactions with other characters, including the snarky, possibly demonic narrator that keeps him company. Admittedly, Van Helsing Jr. and Shadow's Awakening have shockingly similar setups, but Victor Vran's narrative and characterization feels the most setting-appropriate and natural. They also got Doug Cockle to voice Victor, and while he doesn't stray from his famed gruff, witchery style, it still fits the character perfectly. Unlike the previous category, these hack-and-slash action RPGs deviate pretty heavily from the base formula, and won't necessarily match up with Diablo 2 if you're looking for an alternate successor. That said, all 4 of these games are incredible in their own way, and are absolutely worth a look if you're looking to delve deeper into the genre. First up is Chronicon, which is one man's attempt to create his own incredibly deep hack-and-slash action RPG, and I can safely say that he did so above and beyond all expectations. Chronicon follows a very similar structure to Diablo 1, but with a far deeper character build and itemization system. It also has one of the deeper endgame experiences of every game on this list, due to an extensive procedural dungeon generator and purportedly infinite character progression. So if you want to get really lost into a hack-and-slash action RPG for countless hours, I'd recommend this one. Slormancer is a fairly lightweight hack-and-slash action RPG with uncomplicated environments and hordes of relatively easy enemies to blast through. And while it's still in very early access, it more than makes up for that with a robust customizable ability and trait system, alongside weapons that drastically change how you play, that have their own robust trait system. It's a min-maxing funhouse, and really embraces the loot treadmill nature of the genre. The archer also looks like a maniac. She's so happy to be here, killing everything in her way. And you can also specialize into throwing a stick, which is really silly and kind of the best, and it was what originally sold me on the game. Book of Demons is really cool, taking heavy influence structurally, stylistically, and narratively from Diablo 1, but with a papercraft aesthetic and a wildly different set of gameplay mechanics. Sure, you're still delving deeper and deeper into a labyrinthine underground below the town, fighting demons and monsters, collecting randomized loot and abilities, and so on, but your movement is constrained to a set path on the ground, which changes how everything plays and feels while maintaining the core hack-and-slash action RPG identity. The developers also implemented an adventure length system, where you can actually choose how long you want to play per session. It sounds a bit weird, but it's very refreshing to see a game actively trying to respect my time as a player. They also have a sort of sequel on the way. The demo is pretty cool, and I can't wait to dive into that one, but I don't want to talk about it too much because it's still pretty early in development. While most avid hack-and-slash action RPG fans are hardly the target audience for Minecraft Dungeons, it's still a very competent entry to the genre. It plays a bit more like a twin-stick shooter, and the ability system is locked to the gear that you acquire instead of being separate and persistent to the character that you're playing as. But otherwise, it's the same kind of monster-mulching, dungeon-crawling romp. I would also argue that Minecraft Dungeons is probably one of the best starting points for anyone looking to try a hack-and-slash action RPG and has no experience in the genre, as it's tremendously beginner-friendly and eschews a lot of the heavy statistics min-maxing that almost every other game on this list revels in. In preparation for this video, I tried to get a bunch of old hack-and-slash action RPGs working to see how they would hold up and to see if they were worth recommending. Some had promise, but most haven't aged all that well, or simply never matched up to Diablo 1, let alone 2 in terms of depth, breadth, or quality, and don't generally hold a candle to the modern successors that I've listed above. As part of this, I am tentatively including Sacred 2 because I think there's still value in it, but more as a, hey, you tried everything else, so why not play Sacred 2? It still plays perfectly well on modern platforms and is a truly expansive world covered in shockingly nice looking grass for a game from 2008, but the UI is clunky, the combat and exploration is kind of slow, and what little voice acting I ran across was bona fide dumpster grade. You can also play as a Robo Anubis with an arm cannon Jabberwock though, who is accompanied by a pretty sick techno metal soundtrack. Without it, I'm not sure if Sacred 2 would have even made this list. Revenant is odd. It honestly feels more like a traditional CRPG, but with hack-and-slash action RPG combat. But what little I saw of it was really promising. The voice acting was great, the main character was the grumpiest asshole I've seen in a game in years, and the game holds up rather well visually if you don't mind chunky models and slightly fuzzy pre-rendered 3D backgrounds. The art direction for the game really carries it. It did crash on me 30 minutes in though, and took my computer with it, so this recommendation is more for people willing to suffer through getting Revenant working on a DOS emulator, and not for people that are just looking to dive into the genre at first. And lastly is Nox, which I've heard a tremendous amount of praise for over the years, and I can safely say that it absolutely deserves it. Nox looks great for a 21-year-old game, plays mostly fine, and has some really passionate campy voice acting that really elevates the whole game to a higher level. Like Revenant, it's structured more as a linear CRPG and has its own unique combat and ability system that will feel familiar to other games on this list, but it stands on its own mechanically. Unfortunately, unless you're lucky, Nox will take some fiddling to get running, either by running it through a DOS emulator, attempting to change its compatibility to Windows XP, or by downloading one of the community patches off of one of the fan sites. I'll leave a link to the one that I used in the description below. That said, it is worth the effort if you're looking for a hit of extreme nostalgia, or if you want to see something similar to the old Diablo games without drawing any direct influence from any of them. A part of me actually wonders what the genre would have been like if Nox had taken off like Diablo did. But then again, with EA at the helm, I think they would have bungled it pretty badly. And that's it, for now at least. I'm sure in a couple of years I'll have to make a follow-up video to this one with an updated list of newly released hack-and-slash action RPGs, as well as addendums for how to get some of the older ones running. That said, I hope this video showed you some new and interesting alternatives to try. Every single game on this list is a ton of fun, and comfortably stands on its own in contrast and competition to Diablo 1, 2, 3, and likely whatever 4 will ever be if it ever comes out. And Immortal, if that's even coming. Which is great, because no genre should ever be held up by a single series, especially one owned and developed by such a problematic company. Hopefully things will improve on that front, but for now I'm perfectly happy seeing what passionate independent developers can do to advance the genre forward in their own unique ways. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this video as well. It was a ton of fun to make, and I hope to do so again real soon. Speaking of, if there's another semi-niche genre you'd like me to do an overview of, please leave a comment outlining it down below. I rather enjoy putting games into tidy categories, and then recommending the best among them. But for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.